All right, I think we've allowed for the technical time for people to adapt to the broadcast mode. So with that, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us this morning. This is one of our series of HEDNA webinars, this one focused on key areas of focus for payments as we start to recover from COVID-19. We'd like to start off with thanking Adyen, who has continued to be our payment sponsor for all of 2020. We appreciate all of our sponsors this year in light of all of the challenges and complexity, so thanks. We're going to talk a bit more about upcoming events later in the broadcast. However, one of the things I want to make sure we do remember is that, as you all likely know, HEDNA had to cancel its Amsterdam conference, which I believe was we'd probably all be traveling to at this point, because it would have been next week. And in lieu of that HEDNA Amsterdam conference, we have actually decided to do a little mini virtual conference, which we're calling HEDNA at Home, unless we hear from the folks at Saturday Night Live that is a problem. HEDNA at Home will be on Tuesday, June 16th, starting at 3 p.m. Central European Time, 9 a.m. New York East Coast time. And we'll do a 2.5-hour webinar with lots of details coming for that in the coming days, but just wanted to make sure that everyone is aware. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Mike Carlo. I am CEO and founder of a payment company in the travel sector called XanderPay. I'm also proud to be on the HEDNA board and have been focusing on payment topics for HEDNA over the past couple of years, and by couple I mean maybe 8. What I'd like to do before we get started with our, I think, very interesting dialogue, I'd like to ask each of the participants to introduce yourselves and explain the specific working groups that you work with at HEDNA. We've decided that for this webinar, we would focus on our internal expertise, and we do have 3 working groups: the Open Payment Alliance, the Guest-Centric working group, and the third-party compensation group. So we have 3 of the co-chairs of those groups here today. So with that, Laurie, would you like to introduce? And we'll go Laurie, Rachel, Xavier in that order, please.
Okay, girls first. Thanks, Mike. I'm Laurie Gablehouse. I work with Ingenico, ePayments, and I'm the co-chair of the Guest-Centric working group. And our focus up till now obviously has been, well, up until February-ish, we've been working on compliance and the European regulations associated with PSD2. I think we'll talk a little bit more about that coming up. And I've been in the payments industry for the last 8 years, just had my anniversary at the end of April with Ingenico. And with that, I'll pass it over to Rachel.
Hello. I'm Rachel Neal. I am co-chair with Faith Marshall of the third-party compensation working group at HEDNA, and our focus is on the challenges and opportunities with third-party compensations. Previously, we handled primarily commission payments, but as we know, compensation has evolved over the last few years, so we talk a lot about data and reconciliation and things all involved with compensation in this space. Like Laurie, up until February-ish of this year, and we'll see where that picks up after all of this, but yeah, happy to be here.
Okay, I guess it's my turn. So this is Xavier Ginesta. I'm the chairman of Voxel and co-chair of the Open Payment Alliance working group, both at HEDNA and HTNG. So the focus of our working group, of the OPA, Open Payment Alliance working group, originally was twofold. It had to do, on one side, with the streamlining B2B payments, i.e. making them seamless and frictionless. and also right-sizing the cost of payments, which essentially comes down to enabling alternative forms of payment and providing freedom of choice. So that's how we developed the concept of the open payment line at HEDNA, and then turned it into a standard with HTNG. In fact, the first part of the technical specifications of this standard will be released shortly and formally presented in an upcoming webinar on May 26th. Now, the interesting thing is that due to the current crisis, our original focus has been enhanced. And besides the two previous elements that I just mentioned, it turns out that incidentally, this newest standard also does a pretty good job at tackling the issue of trust and risk mitigation, which is something I guess we'll be talking about later today. So, Mike, back to you.
Thank you. One of the things that this is going to be hopefully a very interactive discussion. We all talk a lot, and when we talk a lot, it's sort of difficult to keep up. So because we talk over each other sometimes, maybe, and usually that's me. But we'll do our best to keep this sequential. One of the things that for today's webinar, we would encourage audience questions. There are two options that you have. There's the room chat and the Q&A. We prefer that you put the questions into the Q&A queue, but if you put them into chat, we won't disregard them. So please feel free to ask any questions you might have. To start off, let's try to start off the discussion with something positive about payments and where this crisis can lead us to. I mean, I've seen some positive things. I mean, one of the most amazing positive things is here in Los Angeles, with the complete availability of hotel rooms, we've actually started to try to solve our homeless problem, and hotels are being retrofitted as places for homeless to live. And it's really difficult to try to find a truly positive thing to come out of being shut down for months and the economic chaos associated with it. But that's really, to me, something coming out of this crisis. It's an opportunity. There's overcapacity in hotel rooms and undercapacity in housing. And as I go through and try to think of something fantastic, that's one thing. And Xavier, you've talked a lot about the windows of opportunity that this crisis brings us. So what?
I guess that connects with what I was saying before. Obviously, the industry was used to living in a.
Hey, Xavier.
Hello, can you hear me?
Xavier, you had a very significant mic issue with that.
Okay.
Oh, you're back now. Okay.
Thanks for warning me. I would have hated talking on my own for hours. Can you hear me well now?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, great. So as I was saying, I think the industry was living in a fantastic context of, let's say, abundance, where everything was great. Ever increasing volumes. There were a lot of inefficiencies in the industry, but people could work with them, could live with them. And there was especially a huge level of trust that everything would always work fine and there would be no tragedies. And if every once in a while there was a tragedy, that was part of the business and that was okay. The thing is that now COVID-19 has really turned these three parameters completely upside down. We have a completely new context, and the three defining elements of this context as we start little by little coming out of this crisis will be that there will be much lower volumes than before. Obviously, we pretty much start from scratch, from zero, and little by little they will build up. We don't know how fast, but it's not going to be blazing fast, that's for sure. That means there will be a growing need for cost optimization. Everybody will need to survive on very tight margins, and in those circumstances, just a 1% improvement in efficiency can make the difference between surviving or not. And the third defining element is the question of trust. There will be much lower trust because there's a much higher risk, and that's something that definitely the industry was not used to before. So I think these three elements, we can look at them as something that's okay, that's a tragedy, or we can look at it as an opportunity. And as long as this situation lasts, we have, as you said, Mike, a window of opportunity for changing the old-fashioned ways that we were doing things in the past, and probably which could have taken otherwise decades to change. For instance, take prepaid rates. Prepaid rates have existed for a very long time, but the thing is, OTAs always pre-charge the guest at the time of booking, send a VCC to the hotel, but very rarely the hotels actually charge the card at the time of booking. Most of the times they waited until check-in. So that was business as usual before, and you could say that this was not very smart, but that's the way people were doing business. Now, in the immediate future, this way of working could be considered an act of negligence, not to say directly done. So I could give you many more examples of inefficiencies like this. We could talk about invoice reconciliation, bank reconciliation, chargebacks, breakage, bill back, words that probably don't make a lot of sense to some of you, but for others could become your worst nightmare in the near future. So why did we never tackle these issues before? Probably because, as I said before, we could deal with them. We had other more important things to think about. But, well, guess what? Things have changed, and maybe now we have no other choice but tackling them. So I think that in this context, the good news is that this standard that we had been working on to eliminate inefficiencies actually will directly tackle many of, not only of these inefficiencies, but also this new situation, this lack of trust that's emerging. And I think that we have a great opportunity to accelerate the transition to a more trustworthy, streamlined, and frictionless B2B payment ecosystem.
And for everyone listening in, I mean, Xavi just outlined all of the agenda topics for us today. I mean, really, we're looking at the fundamental realm of payments has changed. Everything as we knew it from a payment perspective is really going to be different. I mean, if you look at it from today, there will be payments at some point in the future. Up until now, over the past 2 months, there haven't been any. Laurie, what I know that you've been doing some research. What are you hearing about that?
Well, I think internally, many payment companies, ours included, are continuing to monitor our own numbers and trying to see where and in what region things are picking up, where they hit bottom, where they start to pick up. I mean, there's several online barometers for that as well in terms of hotel bookings. And I think it mirrors what you hear on the news about Asia moving on a little bit while the rest of us are kind of on their tails in terms of our recovery. And I think, from that perspective, everything kind of matches up. I think the other thing to think about, if you're in this mode, I think with everybody else, I read recently, I had some time to read. Our company is lucky in that we have a diverse portfolio. So in addition to our travel customers, we have digital goods and other companies that are actually doing very well at this moment because of home delivery and ordering online and those types of things. But McKinsey company did a good study about COVID and post and the state of things as they appear now during this pandemic. And I think the beginning of this is really what they call the resolve and resilience phase, where we're all trying to really operationally react to the situation. But to Xavi's point, I think you're close to the middle, where you're talking about figuring out how you return, how you bounce back, how do you manage coming back online, so to speak. And then, but the true opportunity is in those last couple of phases around how do you reimagine what you've been doing? How do you look at how you were doing business, both B2B, which I think is where you have some trust because you had some contracts, you had some relationships that had some structure around them. But the B2C part, I think, is where we do need to do some work and understand how that position for a hotelier can be fortified in different ways, whether those are different payment methods or just different ways of working with their suppliers.
Yeah, so before we get to Rachel, just to follow up on that, I mean, you've worked a lot with airlines. When the shutdown happened, I mean, there's just a tremendous amount of discussion about refunds. Do you refund? Do you voucher?
Chargeback.
And how long is the chargeback? And with hotels, with the exception of some properties, like the Vegas properties, as Rachel had pointed out, all bring in a deposit, and there was a lot that needed to be done there. I mean, what can hoteliers learn from the experience that the airlines went through, if anything?
Well, I think we can all learn from each other, whether you're an airline or a hotel. I think if anything, when it's around your money, you should now pay a lot of attention and more attention, whether you had people who were in charge of this before that were maybe just in the back office doing the accounting work, but maybe now you actually should have a strategic point person that brings all your stakeholders together to help you not only understand what your policies are, your procedures when things need to be refunded. What is your refund policy? What do your terms and conditions say about how you will handle situations that are out of your control on some level? I mean, airlines have always had weather problems, right? But they've had policies around how they deal with that. And those are well published and regulated in some countries. So I think that is, if anything, you should now pay a lot of attention to what you have in writing and maybe shoring that up a little bit with how you support those different scenarios.
But and Rachel, perhaps you could comment on this. I mean, from my perspective, the airlines had a lot more to do when everything shut down, but they had a choice. They could choose or try to choose whether they refunded or whether they vouchered. With the hotel business model, there wasn't that option because almost all of our transactions are either postpaid or VCC paid at time of check-in. What if there's a second wave of COVID in the fall, as people talk about? I mean, what sort of lessons learned can there be for the hoteliers?
Uh-oh.
Rachel, you're on mute. Let's see if I can unmute you. There, I think you're set now.
Perfect. It kept saying the host needed to unmute me, so thank you.
I didn't know that I was the host, so thank you. And
You're
sorry.
so powerful.
I will mute you.
No, I appreciate it. Yeah, absolutely. I think, I mean, it goes to what Laurie and Xavier have both talked about, that just the whole environment of trust and the way that we look at things, the way that we contract things needs to change. You mentioned Vegas and some of the practices that were just standard practices in Vegas that would actually be very beneficial for other areas and other hotel chains and companies to adopt in the future, charging those prepaid rates right away, so you have that money in the bank to be able to do with what you need in the future. Having payments as part of the contracting process to agree not only what payment methods you're going to support as part of that deal, but also the terms under which you're going to do it. To Laurie's point, things about refunds and things about how you're going to handle them, how long you have to be able to handle them. Are we talking net 30, net 60, especially when we start talking about some of the like group payments and centralized payments and things like that. And I think the future means that sort of some of these gentleman handshakes that we've had in the industry for so many years, it's going to have to be on paper, and payments and payment methods are going to have to be part of the regular contracting process when you're talking about distribution channels and you're talking about travel agencies And normally, it's just been about what kinds of rates. Are we doing net rates? Are we doing commissionable rates? What things like that. The payment method that goes along with that is going to have to be part of the contracting process. And I think it's been very interesting because, the travel industry will bounce back. That is something that we know will happen. How fast? I think this will be a new one for us, but we know, especially with people being quarantined and, having to stay at home, people are itching to get out there. And, domestic leisure is forecasted to come back first. And so I think people are getting really creative. And, when you've talked about positive things that are happening in the industry and some things that we can look forward to, I am every day inspired by the creativity that this industry has. And I think people are discovering new partnerships and new opportunities. Just yesterday, we were talking about hotels that are finding amazing local or near local activities to partner up with, to do packaging and to get domestic travelers involved in things. And when you talk about that and payments involved in that, those are partners that have never had any kind of a payment relationship in the past, and they need to do that now. And so I just think that the level of trust and level of contracting it's going to change moving forward.
It's interesting because as you were talking, I was reminded of some of the challenges I've heard with meeting and events, and a lot of the payments and terms of the meeting and event structure is done at property, not necessarily at a brand level. And I've been involved with a couple or tangentially involved with a couple of situations where a conference needed to cancel. The brand was supportive of a full refund of the conference deposits, yet the individual ownership group of the hotel needed the cash. So I think when you talk about contracting, I think it's especially important to that part of the industry where you have large sums of money being deposited up front.
I think this is, if you look at the pressure that this pandemic has put on the entire supply chain, everybody is now going to be very, very clear about where's the money, whose hand is it in? How long is it going to be there? How do I get to it if I need it because one end of this or the other is not in business any longer? I mean, that is the reality that many hotels are facing, and many OTAs, airlines, they're all facing that same wall, wondering, how have we shored up our cash flow and how do we do a better job of that going forward?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great point because for the first time ever, I mean, there always were, as Xavier had said earlier, there was always a trust that everything would function this way. And there was an implicit assumption that every company was going to be there. Yeah. And now there are lots of scenarios where lots of companies don't exist in 3 months, 6 months, or a year. I mean, you have, with the hotel structure, yeah, sure, at a brand level, brands are going to be fine. You don't know, as a traveler, you don't know the leverage of of an individual hotel property. You don't know what day their big term loan is due. So I think that, coupled with the lack of bookings for companies that survive on revenue, which is everyone, becomes a bit of a challenge.
I think if nothing else, you have to look at not only your B2B business has a lot of pressure because you don't know if both businesses at both ends of the chain are going to survive or what their resilience is to situations like this. But, on the B2C side, you also have the consumers out there who probably didn't read the fine print when they bought a package or bought something around where's their money. And if something happens and they need it back, how does that work? So I think, again, back to everybody being a lot more transparent and clear in terms of their procedures, their policies, and understanding where in that supply chain their money is is just a very, very important part of where you need to be focused coming out of this.
Well, and actually that's a great transition to one of our first audience questions. The question is, as hoteliers, we're told that VCCs are the most secure form of payment. What happens if we receive a VCC for a booking and the travel agency goes out of business? So, I guess, Xavier, we'll ask you this question, but, as I read that, the scenario, and we've all talked about this at other conference webinars as well. The guest goes to an OTA today, books a trip for September 1st, pays the OTA issues a VCC, the OTA goes out of business on August 30th, the guest shows up on September 1st at the hotel property thinking, I've paid my room and tax, where's my room? If the OTA goes out of business in that situation, or any travel agency or any booking company, you work with a lot of VCC issuers. I mean, what happens?
Basically, you're screwed.
So if that's the case, I mean,
Xavi, you're
short question. Short, basically, if the hotel.
Can you hear me
there
now?
you go. Now, yes. I think you go back a certain amount, and it.
Okay.
Sorry,
so
go ahead.
Essentially, if the OTA got the money from the guest, send the booking to the hotel with a VCC, but the hotel didn't charge that VCC. When the OTA goes out of business, either the OTA will automatically cancel the VCC, or the issuer will. I mean, one or the other. That VCC is not going to be usable by the time the guest gets to the hotel. That's why I was saying before, prepaid rates can be great in the current situation if people actually get the money at the time of booking. But for whatever reason, which is I don't understand why, but for some reason, the industry has been operating like this forever. When they get a VCC, hotels very rarely they charge the VCC at the time of booking, even though that's a prepaid, sometimes even non-refundable rate. Even in the case of prepaid non-refundable rates, hotels don't charge the VCCs, to the point that I believe that in many cases, OTAs don't even activate the card until the time of booking. It's not that we're getting to the point that even if the hotels try to charge the VCC at the time of booking, in many cases, they would not be able to do it because the card is not active. The cards are activated at the time of check-in or check-out. So that's the current industry standard. That's essentially what happens.
So we've gotten a bunch of different comments on the Q&A on this topic. I think to clarify what you just answered, and something that Rachel had said, when hotels are contracting payment terms, the key is on a prepaid rate to make sure that you get the prepaid payment at the time of payment, and to authorize the VCC immediately as allowed by the contract terms and by the VCC rules. Because as somebody had pointed out, if it's been authorized, the hotel is fine. The issue for the hotels is on a prepaid rate, you really need to make sure that you're processing things in the appropriate time. Is that a good summation?
Yeah, and I think, Mike, one of the things that's important to note in that, one, yes, absolutely, it's the contract terms and the understanding of the way that you're going to do business between the two parties. And then secondary to that is the operational procedures at the hotels. To Xavier's point, most of the hotels don't charge it till time of check-in. Part of that is because the VCC is not authorized to them, but part of that is because that's just the operational procedure of the hotel. They're not looking at what needs to happen with check-ins until a day before, a few days before, or the day of check-ins. But there are hotel companies out there that have made it part of the contract to have it available at time of booking and run multiple batches a day through their payment processor to charge those VCCs at the time of booking, or a couple days after, whenever that VCC is available. So it's the contracting terms, absolutely, so that you can make sure that those are available for charge, but also there's operational front desk changes that will need to happen as well. And that could be just a matter of not enough bodies to do it, honestly, just not enough.
Or
people.
never having had to do it because we never really had these fears. So,
absolutely.
I think that's, and when we talk a little bit later about the Open Payment Alliance standards, that is one of the use cases that, Rachel, you used to be the chair of that group too. So that, one of the Open Payment Alliance use cases was, processing the VCC at the time that it is available. And I think that a future best practice for the industry is going to be really focusing on the timing of payment, because as somebody said before, it might have even been me, I don't remember, we can't be sure that anyone is going to be here in 3 months.
Yep. Yeah, and it's one of, I know Xavier talks a lot about it as well, and it's one of the important things with the OPA is, like, let's eliminate the need for human beings to do that. If you can automate that process and have your payment manager handling the rules behind charging those VCCs at the time that's appropriate, having your PMS be able to automatically trigger it. I know right now there's not a lot of enhancements and development that's happening, but when you're thinking about post-COVID and efficiencies that are going to be so important, to Xavier's point of, 1% efficiency and the bottom line is going to be huge. These are the things to think about. What ways can we automate things? How can we get the money in the bank faster and sooner and in a more efficient way?
Right. I think it's, as you said, Rachel, protocols need to change. But changing protocols involving manual procedures may still involve inefficiencies. So actually, when we started with this project, with this working group, and we studied all the inefficiencies that existed back then when the industry was working fine, not like now, what we identified is that most of the problems didn't have to do with the technology, with VCCs themselves, had to do with the way people were processing cards manually. And when you work manually, you make errors. And when you make errors, you get chargebacks, you get breakage, you lose cards, you overwrite cards, you do all kinds of mistakes. And those mistakes they become administrative inefficiencies, they turn into costs, etc. So I think now this is only gonna get worse. And if we try to change the protocols to be more, to be safer, like as we were suggesting, making sure that the hotels get paid right on time at the time of booking, in case if it's a prepaid rate, that's gonna add a higher level of chance for mistakes unless we fully automate everything. So that's essentially what the Open Payment Alliance is all about automating these every time more sophisticated payment flows that already existed back then. Now they're going to become more sophisticated, and if we don't automate it, if we don't automate them, we'll be in trouble.
Yeah,
hey, Laurie.
Yep. Go ahead, Mike.
Go ahead, and then I'll ask a follow-up question.
I was just going to say, from the Guest-Centric Payment Working Group, that really was part of our original task a few years ago when we set up the group, was to figure out how can you centralize the payment processing to do as much in advance of arrival at the hotel. And the part of the benefit of doing that in advance, not only to the hotel's bottom line as we're talking right now, but there's also the consumer side of that, where you can offer payment methods and ways of paying in advance of arriving at the hotel that are not going to be available at the hotel in many cases. So you can offer payment methods that allow you to see that money in a more efficient manner. So it's not just it's not just about the hotel being more efficient, but there's also the advantage on the guest side.
Well, that's a perfect lead into one of our other topics, Laurie. I mean, we still have strong customer authentication as far as I am aware that's expected in November. I mean, some people expect it to be delayed, but the reality is if it is delayed, they'll make a decision in September and you won't really know until then whether or not it's going to be delayed. So, all of this discussion we're having about trust sort of plays into, well, I shouldn't say plays into, it seems it has the same general solution that the SCA does. I mean, what is your informed opinion about what we should be doing, and how does this all work with the whole construct of, the merchant of record discussion about a hotel brand versus a hotel property?
Well, I think from our perspective, obviously we're compliant with those regulations already, but the challenges have been working that compliance up into the chain of where the consumer is paying. And those sales channels have been difficult for hoteliers because they don't always have or own the interaction with that guest. If those payments are coming from an OTA or from a third party of any sort, and even sometimes from their own website, it's still a challenge for them to figure out, how do I authenticate and comply with that regulation when that payment is happening outside of my hotel property? And, we've had many discussions in the Guest-Centric group, especially around this, in terms of how can we help hoteliers comply with that. And I don't know that this regulation is going to go away. Certainly, many are advocating that it be delayed for this reason and many others. But, and that is actually some of the work that we continue to do at Ingenico, is around making sure that we are supporting our customers and how they can authenticate in advance and manage that data in advance. And the central collection model really is the best approach to that, because then you're collecting that money at the point of interacting with the consumer, and it's done. You've authenticated, you've complied, you're done.
It also seems
that it's that two-step piece that really causes the grief when you start putting things between that interaction and check-in at the hotel.
Well, it also seems that the centralized model sort of solves an issue. I mean, if you think about the power of the brand in customer relationship, I mean, because of the ownership structure, brand X may have 3,000 properties that are owned by 2,000 different groups. If you transact with the brand and one of those properties goes out of business, the brand can work through the details so you as a customer can at least apply your funds to a different property in the portfolio. If you're going to, if the payments are going to the direct property, I'm not sure that you get the same customer or guest confidence with a response.
Yeah, I think it certainly gives you a few more tools as a brand to add value to consumers using your brand. I think it's just one of the many small things that you, at this point in time, need to be shoring up. As this is one of many things that provides a lot of value, not only to the guest, but there's liability shift that protects those who are accepting the card, whether that's the brand or the property. But that liability shift at this point in time is also a very valuable benefit to complying with those rules.
We do have another question from our participants, Laurie, and this one's more directed toward your experience. Are you aware of any increased chargebacks in the crisis with customers who have had prepaid rates but have been unwilling or unable to take up the booked accommodations?
Well, I don't know that I can relate anything to any specific customer of ours or anybody else's, but obviously chargebacks and refunds outweigh sales right now, right? So if you want to look at the graph, it's reversed. And that fraud is a part of payments regardless of the pandemic. Does this scenario make it even exasperated in some way? Absolutely. I think everybody's looking for whatever terms or means that they have as a card holder to ensure that they get their money back if they're out of work or something and they need that money and they can't seem to see the refund happening in a timely fashion. Then unfortunately, I think as a card holder, that is their right. So how you as a merchant who is accepting those cards, how you again have communicated those choices to that guest and how well you've communicated them, that's really critical to avoiding those chargebacks.
Yeah, and
that's a good point.
I think to Laurie and Mike, one of the things that we had talked about before that I think is so important and really kind of a bit of an unknown in the industry right now is that liability. And I mean, we've seen there's a lot of positives and a lot of people are postponing travel, and instead of canceling, they're just rescheduling. And we talked about hotel companies that are issuing credits rather than like full refunds and things like that in an attempt to keep some of that revenue, but just have the stay, happen later. But when we talk about chargebacks and we talk about liability, I mean, Laurie, you talked about how that responsibility sticks with that reservation, even if it's been essentially transferred to a credit or transferred to some kind of voucher for the future.
Well, I think the challenge we all have with I don't know if you want to call it a voucher or a credit or whatever process, gift card, whatever you have internally to park somebody's money for future use. I think that's the best way to look at it. Those systems have never been abused the way they're being abused right now. They were never set up as a way of doing business. They were set up as an exception, right? They weren't set up the way they're being used right now. And because of that, there's no linkage in many, many cases between that original sale and where I've parked your credit. And so it lends itself to abuse by the card holders because maybe they can double dip. It lends itself to challenges with the people who are collecting the money, and have they overextended somebody's credit because they weren't counting everything correctly? I mean, the lack of linkage between all these different events is another complexity to the whole process, and how we shore this up going forward in terms of internal reporting with your acquirer, how all of that links back to that original card sale is very important moving forward, because that honestly is where the exposure is sitting, and it needs to be managed and transparent to everybody who's a stakeholder in the process.
One follow-up, thank you to Rajesh, who pointed out that there already has been a delay in the UK for the SCA for a bit into next year. There has been no such designation from the EU yet, but we can certainly hope. If it's okay, I'd like to switch our conversation to more corporate travel. And I think we can all agree that corporate travel is probably going to be a later recovery than leisure travel. So with the third-party compensation group and Rachel, some of the moves toward different types of compensation, marketing agreements and things like that, away from traditional commission processes. I mean, what do you see as the future? I mean, do we lose the innovation because we don't have any sense of volumes, or can we adjust?
No, I think we can adjust, honestly. I think, just as in the B2C world or in the leisure world, I mean, everybody's going to be looking for efficiencies, and that applies to corporate travel and group travel just as much as it does to leisure travel as well. And I mean, we saw the shift over the last couple of years in compensation models growing, people becoming more creative in that, but also more targeted. where like, we talked about, I mentioned earlier, the kind of the gentleman's handshake on things, that has been going away, and more specific and contracted programs that allow for the hotels to compensate where they want their bookings to be coming from, what types of agencies, what types of groups, what time of the year, things like that, and being able to push the type of product that they need help with. I think that's just going to grow, and that's going to get bigger and bigger. And the beautiful part about that is that these new compensation programs, there are already ways to handle it, from whether it's direct, the centralized pay that we mentioned earlier, third-party payment companies. There's already places that make that an efficient process. It's just a matter of finding the right partner to be able to help you with that. And so I do think that those compensation models are going to get more creative, are going to continue. And efficiency, I think, is going to be the thing that really people are looking at. How can we get our compensation for the right products at the right time and in the most efficient manner?
Now we just need some bookings to test that case with.
Right? I'll put my money where my mouth is in, like, I don't know, 9 to 12 months.
Perfect. Xavi, one of the challenges that we've talked about is it's both corporate bookings and tour operator and some other leisure bookings is the whole concept of invoicing. And with a new payment trust challenge, I mean, how does what we're doing in invoicing as an industry impact the risk associated with non-payment?
Mm-hmm. Okay, actually, just to clarify, because maybe our audience is not so familiar with the question of invoicing, I think invoicing is something that only is used in part of the industry. In the OTA dynamic contracting space, most companies don't use invoicing. In the context of bed banks, corporate travel, and tour operators, invoicing is quite popular, and it's used differently. In the corporate travel space, what happens is that TMCs typically send their bookings to hotels, and they put typically a VCC with them, and then the hotel charges the VCC at checkout, and that's it, end of the story. There's no invoice. The problem is that very commonly the TMCs need an invoice from the hotel because they need to re-invoice their customer, their corporate customer. And unless they have, in the case of Europe, a VAT compliant invoice, they cannot invoice the VAT to their corporate customer. And then there's a discrepancy between the amount that there's a difference between what they can charge to the corporate customer and what they paid the hotel, and this difference is the VAT. They cannot charge the VAT to their corporate customer unless they got a VAT compliant invoice from their hotel. And VAT in the UK, for instance, is 21%. So you can imagine if you don't get a VAT compliant invoice, you're losing much more money than you're making on that booking. So getting the invoices is key for many TMCs that operate in Europe and in this way. Now, in the tour operating space, it's a totally different story. The tour operating space basically works like all other industries in the planet, except for the rest of the travel industry. The clients, the tour operators, pay their suppliers, the hotels, once they receive an invoice, and invoices are sent after checkout. So it's after checkout that the hotel send the invoice to the tour operator processes the invoice and pays afterwards. Now, we come from a time 20 years or more ago where this process was a cumbersome manual process that took time. And because of that, tour operators are used to paying hotels on net 30 up to net 60 or even more terms. And that's because in the past, it took time to process invoices and manually. The point is that today that's no longer the case because we have electronic invoicing, we have electronic payments, and this whole process of sending the invoice, reconciling it, and paying the invoice to the supplier could take minutes. but we're still stuck with the old procedures. People kept doing the things they were doing in the past year after year, and at some point this became a business model for many tour operators and even bed banks. They actually rely on the fact that they have the working capital since the time of booking until 30 or 60 days after checkout. And now it's very hard to get them out of that thing. But this is absurd. I mean, they factored in this operational model into an actual business model, and this makes no sense. And the problem is that in the current scenario with the much higher level of risk, it is a big issue. And especially for hotels, having their money sitting for months in the tour operator's bank account is a huge risk. And it's a risk that can be efficiently mitigating by proper use of technology. And back to the corporate travel space, same thing. Generating an invoice after the time of checkout and sending it back to the TMC so that they can recover the VAT. It's also something that can be fully automated electronically. And it's very simple, actually. It could be done, and it has not been done because, as I said before, the industry had other priorities. But now maybe we have this window of opportunity to implement all those things that were hard to implement before.
Well, just to point out or to reemphasize, I think the big challenge is cash is going to need to move quickly because there is effectively a going concern for every company in the sector. And I know that's really hard to hear, but that's just the situation we're in. What I'd like to do for a couple of minutes is just blast through a few of the audience questions. And I'm not going to read them all, but someone did ask about when Rachel was talking about contracted payments, can we align flexible cancellation? I think that's a great question. And I think with everything we do, there is an opportunity to have flexibility with cancellations. You look at airlines and you can pay for a fully refundable ticket, but you pay for it at the same time. So I think terms and conditions need to be looked at with the COVID situation in mind. It's always, from a hotelier standpoint, it's always easier to have money and then give it back. From a consumer standpoint, they certainly don't want to. They don't want to pay up front if they don't know that your property is going to exist in 6 months. I mean, there's going to be a lot of balancing as we go forward because of the situation. I think a lot of the questions have been addressed in our previous discussion. There was one that I'm going to read parts of it. If hotels continue to rely on OTAs post-pandemic, then OTAs will continue to dictate how hotels will get paid, when they're paid, and the cost of funds. What's the panel's view on how brands will distribute post-COVID? Rachel, do you want to take that one?
So I think it's interesting, and this is something that I've always found interesting, the kind of mismatch between the B2C and B2B world as far as payments go. There's nothing from a technology perspective that stops the OTAs from putting the same rules on their payment methods, including the VCCs, that are put on the B2C cancellation, prepayment, no-show, whatever those rules are. It's kind of just been this understood procedure, or to Xavier's point earlier, just kind of the way that it's been done in the industry for so long, that the cancellation policy or the booking policy that's shown to the consumer that says this is a prepaid rate, or there's a deposit due at the time that you book this, that is shown to the consumer, and they have to click to agree and all of that. But then on the back end of that, the VCC is then just authorized to be available at time of check-in, which doesn't match the policy. And that's just because a lot of it's, technology, like the booker, the distributor has a single process that they apply to all their VCCs that they put out there. But intelligence can be put into the system to match the booking policy and the deposit policy with the VCC rules that are applied to that VCC that's sent to the hotel. And then it's on the hotel side to, charge that at the time in accordance. So yes, the OTAs are dictating the payment methods as far as this is going to be a VCC or not. But I would say the hotels also have the opportunity to enforce through their partnership with the OTAs that those policies match up, that the policies that they are setting on those rates that are being sold to that OTA or through that OTA are also applied to the payment methods that the OTAs are using to the hotels. And it's just something that's not been done historically within the industry, but there's no technology reason that's stopping that from happening. It's just kind of the way that it's always been. So I think it's just really on the onus of both sides to pay attention to that and make some changes that, I think, to both Xavier and Laurie's point, that it just hasn't, the focus hasn't been on that up until this point, but now it's something that's important and needs to be paid attention to.
Thank you. And so we have a couple of minutes left, and I'm going to eventually ask each of the panelists their one takeaway from today. I think on behalf of HEDNA, I want to point out to everyone that the Open Payment Alliance has been doing tremendously good work on the infrastructure to facilitate some of these processes. And the Open Payment Alliance has partnered with HTNG and Open Travel Alliance, and we're developing standards that we need everyone to adopt. There's a call, there's an HTNG call later this month. Xavier's leading another call a few days after that to talk about more of the commercial implications of this. When we send out the details to the webinar, or to the link to this webinar, we'll include those dates as well, so that you have those. But I think it's really important that as an industry, we acknowledge that things are going to change from a payment perspective. There is a lot different, the landscape is a lot different, and there are different risks everywhere. And we're gonna work really hard to balance them so that we all get through this. So that's my takeaway. With that, I'll say one last thing at the end, but let's go in reverse order of last time with one takeaway. Xavier, please.
Sure. Maybe I'll repeat myself in a way, but I think that we have a great opportunity as an industry to change things that we all knew all the way that were wrong, that were inefficient, but we were doing them as a matter of habit. So instead of complaining about the pain caused by this virus, we should look at the things that we'll be able to change thanks to the virus. I think it's a time of opportunity, and we should really take this period as a maintenance downtime to use it in order to get ourselves one step ahead of our competitors. So as you said, Mike, we have some webinars coming up, one with HTNG to present. It's going to be the official release of this newest standard. And on the 28th, we'll be hosting another webinar to show how we kind of start leveraging the Open Payment Alliance standard in order to mitigate risks and generate efficiencies that have been long waiting for. I guess that's my takeaway.
Thank you very much. Rachel.
I echo the efficiency claim there, but also I would say look at your contracts. I mean, that's from a personal life perspective. Look at your contracts. Look at your mobile contracts, whatever. Look at everything. But I mean, from doing business, there's so many things that we've just let be evergreen and just continue as it always has been. And I would say take this opportunity to look at those contracts and see where you have the opportunities to shore those up and tighten up those terms. And eliminate some of the ambiguity that's in there, and the understood agreements, and make them black and white.
Thank you very much. Laurie?
Yeah, I mean, I echo all of that. I think this honestly is a wonderful opportunity to do things differently. And if you can do anything at this point in time around working with your payment partner as a strategic partner and figuring out what can your new normal be, how can it be better, and how can it be more efficient, that I agree that I don't think the technology is the problem. I think how we've been doing business and how we think about how we do business is within everybody's control to change.
Well, thank you, Laurie. Thank you, everyone, for listening through this webinar. Thanks to the panelists. And I just want to remind everyone, please put Tuesday, June 16th, 3 p.m. Central European Time, 9 a.m. Eastern Time for the HEDNA at Home mini webinar, or mini conference webinar. So thanks, everyone. Have a wonderful day, whatever it is.
Thank you.
Bye.